Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of an Evolved Review. I am joined today by my co host, as always, Caleb Stovall of the Stovall Wrestling Network. Welcome, Caleb.
Thank you very much, man. It's always a pleasure. Especially
Absolutely.
during all of this quarantine stuff. It's still going on, man.
Yeah, exactly. If you're watching this sometime after the great quarantine of 2020 has ended, then this will kind of be a look back into what that looked like for some of us. And that being said, we have a very special guest on the program today. He is one of my best friends. That's the start of his credentials. He has over 20 years in law enforcement. He is a former special agent with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and he is currently a pre sentence investigator for the U.S. federal government. Welcome, Joe Brown.
Holy crap.
Hey guys, appreciate it.
Right? I mean, the credentials. And so this is a very
I didn't know all that.
well, now you do. Uh, this is a very special episode to have you on. We're covering the killing of Bruiser Brody. This is, of course, another episode of Dark Side of the Ring that we're going to dive into. So if you haven't seen the episode, it's made by Viceland. You can find it on like Google Play. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on Hulu. It's all over the place. So if you haven't seen that yet, you'll definitely get a lot more out of this episode if you consume that first. So go and check out this incredible episode of Dark Side of the Ring featuring Bruiser Brody, and then come back and see us. So we kind of get into it here, just kind of overall what the overview on this episode. Joe, when you watch this, kind of were you aware of this incident, and then this kind of filled you in on it? Um, how did this kind of sound to you when you first saw the episode?
Yeah, I was vaguely aware of the whole thing with Bruiser Brody. Basically, I knew he was killed in Puerto Rico uh, at or prior to a wrestling match, and that was just about the end of it. I wasn't aware of all the ins and outs and the fact that basically somebody got away with murder. But yeah, this gave a lot of information and some eyewitness accounts even. So I really enjoyed the episode, considering my background and interest in wrestling.
What? So, were you familiar with like Bruiser Brody and any of his work prior to this, or was he kind of like before you got into wrestling too?
I mean, yes and no. I was aware of who he was. I have an old book called Heroes and Villains, and it came out in the mid 80s. And Hogan's on the cover, and it goes into a lot of wrestlers that a lot of people probably did not follow in the mid 80s because it went from everything from WWE, WWF at that time to some New Japan guys and things like that. And Bruiser Brody's in that. And that was probably the extent of my knowledge of Bruiser Brody and his career at that point.
And Caleb, you and I talked about this earlier. He kind of predated our experience. I mean, I know for me, like mid '80s is kind of where my firsthand knowledge stops, mostly because I wasn't alive
Mhm.
until '87. But I mean, I went back and I've seen some of the mid '80s stuff. But if you go into early '80s and beyond that, unless it's somebody like Ric Flair or somebody like that I've read their book and have gone back and watched their matches, I don't really have a whole lot of knowledge of that. And I know we talked about it a little before the episode. What was your opinion of Bruiser Brody like going into this episode?
I had I didn't really know really anything about him. I just and I don't want to piss off wrestling fans or anything like that with that statement, but I didn't know anything about him. It was before my time. The only thing that I had ever heard, and I kind of heard it as almost like a joke at the same time, which is cruel, but that's just how I heard it, was the death of Bruiser Brody. That like, oh, he was killed in a shower or something like that, and I was like, okay. So I didn't really know anything about it, but then of course, like me, whenever I watch something like this and I've never seen it before, and they talk about it, then it's like, okay, I have to go back and check some of this stuff out. So I went on YouTube, and you can find like a lot of his throwback stuff and everything like that from Japan. You can definitely find a lot of him and Abdullah the Butcher on there. And I got to say, man, people can call ECW hardcore, people can call FMW hardcore, all of this other stuff, man. Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher were hardcore before that word was even invented or even thought of. Like they just they took it to a new level. And I wonder, like, if you were alive back then, what that must have been like, because at that time people still believed in the business, people
Right.
still thought it was real. And when you and they even covered it in the documentary, when you turned it up to that level, when you had like blood and stuff like they did, then the people really thought it was real. Then they were like, oh my god, like that's too much, like these guys are going to kill each other kind of thing.
Yeah,
um
if you 100% believe this is real, and then you see a guy sticking a fork into another dude's eye,
yes.
you know,
Yeah.
and I thought it was interesting that they had Mick Foley narrate this. I thought that added a lot to somebody
Mhm.
who doesn't have a lot of experience with these guys, but we do have a lot of experience with Mick Foley. And
Yeah.
so for Mick Foley to list Bruiser Brody as like one of his heroes and one of his like icons that he, modeled himself after, I thought that gave a lot of weight to, his presence in the industry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because for a lot of the years we've heard that, like the moment that got him into wrestling was, the Jimmy Superfly snooker leap off the top of the cage on Don Morocco. But after that, yeah, you kind of wonder what else he watched and stuff like that. And he straight up said he was like I straight like he said in documentaries before that he straight up stole ideas from Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher, like in his matches. Like he said, some of the spots that he's done in in ECW and stuff like that, he would steal from like Bruiser Brody and stuff like that. So that's cool. And they don't usually do it that way on Dark Side of the Ring. They don't usually open up with the narrator like in front of the camera, really. And I think that's because, they realize like probably a lot of people today are not, very familiar with Bruiser Brody, but then it's like you said, having Mick Foley be that face to come, and you're like, oh, well, we know Mick Foley, and oh, okay, we need to hear this kind of thing.
right.
So definitely a different way of doing it, because like I said, I think it's the only episode that they've ever done it that way.
Yeah, I think for me, guys like you guys that are a little bit younger than me that were almost completely unaware of Bruiser Brody. Mick Foley, I wrote this down. The quote was, I wanted to be the next Bruiser Brody. That's what he said, essentially to open this up. So there's your hook.
Yeah,
Okay, there's legitimacy here. I'm going to watch this. I'm not fully aware of who Bruiser Brody is, but just like Alice Cooper says, if it weren't for the Beatles, there'd be no Alice Cooper. Okay, well, I got to go listen to the Beatles now.
yeah,
Same thing.
Yeah,
yeah,
it,
yeah.
it was a brilliant way to open the episode. And
I
Absolutely.
and
And if I could real quick, when I saw the images of Bruiser Brody, I have never seen anyone walk out to a crowd, not even Andre the Giant, walk out and people are running from him. Like
yeah,
like they're literally fearing for their lives. And I love Dutch Mantel, one of the most greatest minds in the business. He's like, that's an art.
yeah.
I'm like, yep,
I mean,
that is.
Yeah.
they really thought that this guy was this giant madman. And and once again, if you believe that this stuff is real, which in these days a lot, the business is very protected. And his wife talks about he got out of the car, took his hair down, and he went from this gentle, like loving, like family guy to the gimmick, and that's who he was. And so if you believe, and this is going to come up later when we start getting into the murder investigation, if you believe that this is real and you see this giant dude hit people with a chain and all this other stuff, you're gonna run. There's no telling what he's gonna do. This is before the years of athletic commissions and guardrails and, like this invisible barrier. You saw him going up into the stands and swinging that
Yeah.
chain in one of the clips that they showed, and like people are like ducking under it, and running off. Like, and he didn't. I mean, he didn't care if he hit anybody with it.
No,
You
he
know,
wasn't checking his six or anything when he was
no,
swinging that thing
no, he was
around.
just whipping it, man.
Nope, he
You know,
didn't care. Case in point, right? So years later, right, in 1999 of all eras, right? I saw an episode on Superstars. I had never seen a fan get attacked by another wrestler like this. Okay, I don't know. I just had never seen it like this. And Kane goes and choke slams the guy, the guy, and he choke slams it like I don't. I looked at my dad. I was like, Dad, don't ever take me to a WWE event. He attacked their face. He goes, this is what my dad said. My dad's gonna get heat, but it's okay. He goes, Caleb, it's fake. Like these guys are for real. I went, what?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, but back then
So
nobody.
imagine if, yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
was gonna say. Like that's what I believe in 1999, which by then everyone figured it out by that point. But this was then when they still believed it. So it was like, ooh.
Yeah. So, they talk a little bit about, his career. Like in Japan, he's still like revered as like one of the all-time greats to this very day. And I mean, if you look at kind of his body of work, like a lot of like wrestling purists today look down on that sort of hardcore style. Like if him and Abdullah the Butcher were alive today and they were doing the things that they're doing, I don't think we would have the reverence for them that like the Puerto Ricans or the Japanese had, where we would look at them like people look at like Sandman or Sabu or something like that today, and then Jim Cornette would probably be going off the rails about them. Um, and so, what did you think about that, Joe? About kind of the style that they worked and like the fact that like that type of match was a main event in that time.
Yeah, that definitely shows, and the fact that they were the main event may have been because of what they were doing. We know these guys are going to bleed. We know they're going to swing a chain around and beat the hell out of each other. I was watching and thinking as I watched Brody and Abdullah go at it, I'm thinking this is like the wrestling equivalent of Freddy versus Jason horror movie. You got these two psychopaths that they'll do anything and they're gonna hurt each other, and that's a draw. Yeah, you're talking about like, could they do a moonsault? Probably neither one of them could. And so, like you're saying, guys today may think, they're just a kind of like a sideshow because of their antics with the chain, the fork, and things like that. But people paid to see that blood. I mean, every one of these commentators said that. Tony Atlas said that. Dutch Mantel said that. So that was the draw.
And that's the thing too, is like these guys were working. They weren't doing arm drags and back breakers and suplexes, and nothing against any of that stuff, but these guys were working a fight. And Abdullah, even in the interview, is still protecting the business. He calls Brody a friend later, but he's still like, there's nothing fake about what we were doing. It was
Right.
real. And I mean, to an extent, I mean, none of that was fake blood. I mean, they were all getting busted open the hard way.
The
Whether they
hard
were
way, right?
whether they were gigging or not, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But they don't say, obviously. Um,
Right.
but I mean, obviously they weren't going out there and sticking forks in each other's eyes every night, but people believed in it. So, um, let's kind of get into kind of the setting for the Puerto Rico situation. So, um, there was two big organizations in Puerto Rico at the time: Caribbean Championship Wrestling and World Wrestling Council, which was the big one, and that one was primarily owned by Carlos Colon, um, and some other people that we're familiar with that kind of owned part of that was Gorilla Monsoon, who was a huge presence in wrestling at the time. Um, had either one of you guys like had any familiarity with World Wrestling Council prior to this?
Not
No.
for me. No.
Yeah, and I think that's probably most people that were watching this. Um, so Brody goes down there, and apparently the Puerto Rican crowd absolutely loves these bloodbath type matches that Brody and Abdullah are putting on. Um, and they showed some clips of them, and it was kind of out of this world. Um, and at the time, we talk about people thought this is real. They talk about being on the way to the building, and like the traffic was just to the point that you couldn't get through it.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
and so these shows were sold out. Um, probably every single time they were doing them, right? Um, so the number one kind of guy in World Wrestling Council was Jose Gonzalez, who is our antagonist here in this tale, and also known as Invader Number One. So
Mm.
it sounds like from the documentary, from what Dutch Mantel says in the documentary, that these guys clashed almost immediately. Um, and he was this is a guy who's a Puerto Rican national, and he's a big star there in Puerto Rico, and then this kind of United States slash Japanese star comes in down there, and he's getting all this kind of attention. And I don't know if anybody here is intimately familiar with Invader Number One's work, but we have seen plenty of other instances in the wrestling business, in show business in general, even in professional sports, of like this type of thing happening. What did you guys think about this situation?
Uh, you know, it's interesting because we talk about back then they protected the business and stuff like that, but they even say it in the documentary that it's one of those instances where it's like, hey man, I can't let you beat up on me like that. Like it will kill my character. My character is just way too hot right now, and if you do that, it's gonna you know kill my kill my momentum and stuff like that. And back then they had much different rules inside of the business than they do today, obviously. And I don't know. I think that that's a weird situation, because if you explain that to a normal person that doesn't know anything about wrestling, they're going to look and they'll say, "Well, Brody was the one that was wrong." But if you explain to that someone in the business, it's kind of like, "Well, no, Brody was right." So it's very, I don't know. It's a weird situation, but I think it's a situation that he held on way too long to. But hey,
What about you,
mix it.
Joe?
Yeah.
You know, doing a little extra research, and you heard Dutch Mantel say Brody was going to look out for himself because of his brand, the name. He couldn't lose a bunch of matches or get beat by a smaller guy, things like that. And doing some extra research, it's like a 50-50 split of people who are like, no, Brody's it fine was fine to work with, and the other half saying no, he was completely he looked out for himself, and if you tried to get him to take the loss, he wasn't going under. He was going to fight that. So I guess it kind of depends on who was catering to him, and if they had maybe given him 3 or 4 wins, maybe the next one you drop a match and then you come back and beat that person the next time. So there was a definite split there, but it's obvious that Brody did look out for Brody, and apparently he had bad blood with Gonzalez anyway. So there's 2 reasons he don't want to put him over.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, everybody that kind of talks about him says, hey, if he liked you, he was the greatest guy in the world. If he didn't
Right.
like you, you rubbed him the wrong way, he would go out there and he would have a stiff match with you. They even talk about to the point that, he had a match with Jose, and, we don't get his viewpoint on this or anything, so we don't know where the bad blood ultimately came from. And, said his head looked like a pumpkin, that he just, beat the mess out of this guy. And, and so understandably, I mean, you would be angry, especially if this guy's coming down into a territory where you're like the Hulk Hogan of Puerto Rico, is what it sounds like, and
Yeah.
this guy just manhandles you.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can understand why there would be bad blood there and a lot of tension. Um, I don't think you kill the guy over it, but
I was going to say.
but we'll get into that. So Tony Atlas is kind of our kind of main eyes and ears into the politics of all this and the way that this all went down. I absolutely loved him as kind of the audience's kind of doorway into the scenario, and I thought that everything he said was really like earnest and really just like just down to earth. and you could feel the emotion when he spoke that this is something that bothers him to this day. Um, Joe, what did you think about Tony Atlas here and kind of like the build up to the events of all this?
So I definitely like the way Tony told the story, and clearly he wanted to. He said, "Can I tell it? Can I tell it? Please let me tell this story." But I think he gave a little bit of sensationalism a few times. And I don't know if you want to get into the aspects of people lying or having motivation to lie now or later, but there were a few things he said that I called BS on immediately. But overall, I think his side of things is probably the way they happened. Um, but yeah, I definitely enjoyed hearing that first person's perspective. He's basically the only eyewitness of the whole thing.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. What did you think about that Tony Atlas here, Caleb?
I mean, I don't have much questioning on him per se because to me it's like if he's sitting there like, well, can I please tell this story, please, please, can I just do it? Like, and they had, they were going to ease him into it. Like you could tell that they were just kind of trying to ease him into the questioning, like they do everyone really.
Right.
It's a respectful kind of thing, but he's just like, no, man, let me just do it right now.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't know how much BS you can call on him because to me, I'm just like, why would he make? What reason does he have to lie right now?
I agree. Yeah, I mean, you look at it and it's like he, to me, like even in the Benoit episodes,
Mm-hmm.
the his family that had not publicly spoken about this at all up until now, even they weren't like, I have got to tell this. And you could tell that this has just been eating at him. And I'm sure when he got the call that he was going to come do this documentary, that it was like, oh man, I gotta, I've got to get this off my chest. Um, he's probably the only speaker on this, other than Brody's like, family, that um, that I don't have any doubts about what they're saying. Um,
What about Dutch?
even
Yeah,
even Dutch, even Dutch.
Really?
Uh, not that I'm saying that Dutch has a reason to lie here, but there's a couple of times when Dutch talks about certain things that I don't know that he's lying, but I think maybe he is staying out of it a little bit. You know what I'm saying? I think he's not telling everything he knows. Does that make sense to you guys? I mean, am I alone in that? Did you either one of you kind of get that?
only time I got that was when they were talking about if Abdullah was there or not
Right.
in that meeting that they had supposedly at the hotel and
Yeah.
everything like that.
Yeah. What about you, Joe? Did you get that from him at all?
Maybe a little bit. Maybe in a sense of kind of protecting the overall business. He
Right.
didn't maybe give every detail. Yeah. But to me, I felt like he was the most honest. And again, I like Tony Atlas, but I just think he sensationalized a few things.
That's
Um,
possible for sure.
and not again, not taken away from the big facts. Did Brody get stabbed? Was it Gonzalez? And did Tony take him to the hospital? Did Tony call him out in the locker room later? I believe all that, and that's the meat of it. I'm not worried about the small things, but I just noticed a few small things that immediately I said, "Huh?"
Right. And I mean, these he is a professional
Yeah,
wrestler.
Yeah.
you know everything that comes with that.
I can understand that. I was yeah, like when I was talking about Tony Atlas, I was more referring to like the incident itself. Like I just don't
Oh, yeah.
everything he said was true. Like that is exactly how it went down pretty much.
Yeah. I want to talk about Jeff and Barbara real quick, which is Brody's wife and kid. I thought that their perspective here was incredible because the whole world, other than like the people he was on the road with, like Tony Atlas or Dutch Mantel, they knew that this guy is this monster. I mean, you saw in some of his promos, he didn't even speak words. He just like made noises and things like this.
Us.
Yeah, because that's the gimmick. He's a madman. Yeah,
Carlos, Carlos.
yeah,
Right.
he's a madman, and so that's who he was. to the world at large. But his wife, describes him as this sweet sort of family guy. And one of the things that was hard to listen to or watch with this was when his son Jeff, man, you can really tell. I think even more than, and I keep going back to this because it's like the worst case scenario, even more than Benoit's son. Like I felt like this dude has like incredible amounts of like repressed anger about this situation, understandably. But I mean, I just felt it from him more than I did even, like I said, from Benoit's son in that episode, where when he talks about this, you can tell that he has a lot of anger about this, and I think that he carries this around with him all the time.
I would say that would be because if I were a betting man, because if you want to look at Chris Benoit's son and everything like that, he can't piece together what happened. He's still trying to figure out what happened. In this instance, it's clear what happened. He's like, I know who is the murderer in this kind of thing. And so it's more like he wants justice. And also the fact of Brody was at that time where you traveled almost 350 days a year, pretty much, for wrestling then, and probably didn't see a lot of his son. So his son doesn't have that very many memories of him.
Right? Yeah.
So that's why I think he's more angry because he never got to know his dad, and it's all because someone decided that they wanted to kill him.
Understandable. Definitely understandable. Um, so let's kind of go into the events. We've been beating around the bush here a little bit. So the events as they happen. So we've got Brody. He's trying to buy in to World Wrestling Council, right? So the rumor, and none of this is 100% confirmed. There's no bill of sale on record or anything. The rumor is that Gorilla Monsoon sold his shares of World Wrestling Council to Bruiser Brody. And back then, I mean, unlike today, where like a lot of wrestling companies, unless you're one of the major ones, don't make enough money for there to be multiple owners. Nobody's trying to buy into these companies because there's not a ton of profit coming out of it. But in the wrestling territory days, if you owned a chunk of the territory, you were getting dividends on that. Abdullah talks about him being a 5% owner. And Brody wanted to buy into this territory because it was a hot territory. He was feared and beloved there, and they were very much into the style of wrestling that both him and Abdullah were into. And he was making a lot of money there, so of course he wants to get a piece of that. He talks about them owing him $25,000, and $25,000 today is a lot of money, but you got to think about how much that would have been in the '80s. You
Right.
know, that's a ton of money. you know, um, and so we've kind of got that set up where he's starting to. You can tell there's a little bit of frustration because Jose is the booker. Carlos Colon is like the promoter, and it seems kind of like Jose is kind of his boy. And as we know in the wrestling business, that kind of thing happens where you've got people in power that are close, and they're gonna look after their own interests or the interests of their buddies, buddy booking as the term goes. Um, so they owe him some money, and Brody's telling people when he goes down there, "I'm coming back with my damn money." Um,
Who's
so
stopping too?
right. He's like, they're gonna give me my money, or I'm beat the hell out of them until I get my money. Um, so Brody already goes down there saying they owe me this money. Now it's not clear if like he earned that money as a performer and they owed it to him, or if he bought into the business and then this is like his cut or something like that. That's not really made clear. Um, so he goes down there and he goes and him and Tony Atlas are working out every day, and Dutch Mantel is there, and Abdullah is there. Kind of all our key players here. Um, and they're talking about they got to the show a little bit late, and they kind of um, one of the reasons they got there late though was because Jose was supposed to pick up Brody from the hotel, and this is kind of the first sign of where things are going awry, right? Because you've got the
Mhm.
booker who's picking up a said he's going to pick up a top star from the hotel day of the show, and he's not there. I mean, that's unfathomable for me, right? You know, if you're advertising a talent, you're supposed to go get them from the hotel, and you're going to drop the ball on that. Which I mean, you're dropping the ball on yourself.
Yeah.
Your main event guy doesn't make it to the show that night. You know, that's on you. So what did you guys think about kind of the lead up to all of this?
Uh, when they start explaining it, right, and I heard those details, I was like, yeah, that's definitely odd right there. Um, and the fact that he was like, well, you come ride with us and stuff like that. That's normal and stuff like that. It's more when they get to the arena, right, or the stadium, and already you could tell that even Dutch and Tony were just like, yeah, now that I look back on it, it was weird, because he's like, Jose's sitting right here. Carlos Colon sitting right there. And who was the other guy that was sitting there?
It was I have it down here somewhere.
Was it Victor Quinones?
Yeah,
I think, yeah,
that's
Victor
the other
King.
guy.
Yeah.
They don't
They're
mention
all,
him a whole lot other than that he was there.
yeah. Well, it said that they were just sitting there, right? And they said that that was weird because it was like they weren't talking. They were just sitting there like they were waiting. It's kind of like you wonder, like, had he gotten there, but by himself without Dutch and Tony there, what would have happened right there? Kind of thing. It just it all right there, just right when they start at the hotel, it's just like, oh well, you can already tell this is going downhill because right off the bat, it just all seems fishy. And I would think you as a lawman yourself could see that right off the bat.
Well, there are a lot of things that definitely showed there was tension and conflict, and the money thing, the fact that I think it was two different people, Dutch being one of them, said that if Brody bought in and became an owner, he was going to get rid of Jose Gonzalez. And
Mm-hmm.
so here's your one of your top stars. Carlos Colon may be number one, Gonzalez, maybe two or whatever because of the buddy booking. And all of a sudden, this guy's going to come in that you already don't like, that's beating you to a pulp at least once, and he's going to boot you. Yeah, there's some issues going on for sure, long before this date. And this was just, I think, the tidal wave is about to hit finally.
Yeah, absolutely. So the actual event itself takes place, right? So we've got well, the only account we have of this because Jose refused to be interviewed, and Bruiser
I
Brody is
wonder
dead,
why.
right? So we have Tony Atlas who says that he was sketching something on his sketch pad and he asked him to do a sketch of his son, showed him the picture. This was like heartbreaking. Um, I kind of hope he embellished that, like, because if that's what really happened, then man, that is tragic. And he says Jose said, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" They went into like the shower area. They started, got into a verbal confrontation, and then all of a sudden he knows Brody makes this like horrible sound, and he just goes. He sees them all doubled over, and he thinks there's a fight started here, but you got a pretty small guy up against a guy like Brody. I don't think Gonzalez would have stood much of a chance in a fist fight with this guy. Um, and as we learn later in the episode, he stabbed him twice. There were two 8-inch lacerations,
Right.
which, I mean, man. And he said the knife was so sharp, he pulled Brody backwards, and that the third, like, swipe cut some of his hair off, that the knife was that sharp. I mean, that's a sharp knife if you're going to just arbitrarily swing it and cut somebody's hair off. And then,
If you
once
believe
again,
that part.
and that could have been one of those embellishments that we talked about. Um,
Mm.
and the knife was never found, so we'll never know really kind of the details on it. So this happens, and basically Carlos Colon comes in and he attempts to get Jose Gonzalez, like, kind of like push him back or whatever, and like kind of closes him in the shower. Um, what do you guys? So, do you guys think Carlos Colon was in on this whole thing and was just kind of acting here?
Yes, yes. I just think that everything that I've heard, because again, we go back to Brody probably bought in kind of thing. So he's
Right.
taking money away from them. And he's just like, well, hey, he probably looks at his buddy and goes, well, hey, you already hate the motherfucker, so why don't you, what, and I'll just, so yeah, he's acting at that instance because, I just think, we go back, and I didn't mean to jump ahead if I did, but like, if you go back when they walk in there, the three of them are sitting there, and from what I can tell from everyone's description, is that it's kind of like that mafia scene in a movie where it's like we're waiting on you, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like it's just like that scene where you realize that like, okay, something bad is about to happen, and you just don't know when it's going to happen. The sketching and stuff like that, I don't know what to make of that and stuff like that, but the sound that Tony Atlas says that Brody made, like every time I see it, I'm just like, oh my god,
Just
like
cringe. Yeah.
it's just heart-wrenching. um and yes, I do believe that Carlos Colon had something to do with this, because again, there's so much evidence pointing towards him, in this. But at the end of the day, it's Jose Gonzalez, that basically did it. So,
Joe,
but
what's your take on this and kind of like when it comes to the investigation? Like, the investigation doesn't seem like it ever verified any of these details. And so, like, what's your take on kind of the whole scenario? Like, Tony Alice's kind of testimony on this, um, which we never got to hear him, you know, s- say under oath or anything in courtroom. We'll get to that. But what's your take on like Tony Atlas's recount of these events, Carlos Colon's involvement, so on and so forth?
As far as Carlos Colon, the only thing I think that may be a little bit off with that, he definitely knew about it, was in on it, that sort of thing. I think there's a possibility that he didn't want Carlos to do it before the show, and it
Is
may
that
have
you mean?
took him by surprise that, hey, we got to let this guy work first, then cut him, don't pay him, or whatever. But Carlos was definitely. I mean, look, that 30 seconds of that shoot interview they showed, he was not comfortable at all talking about this at all. He wanted to change the subject immediately. He didn't look up from the ground as soon as the topic came up. Carlos Colon knows way more than he was letting on. But yeah, I think there was maybe some miscommunication, or Gonzalez may have jumped the gun. By the way, I looked up. Apparently, Bruiser Brody was supposed to wrestle Danny Spivey that night. So
Interesting.
I thought that was interesting because it wasn't Gonzalez he was supposed to wrestle, or Cologne, or one of those guys. So I thought that was kind of, I expected
well,
it to
that
be
would
one
have
of
been amazing.
Yeah.
those. Right.
That
Well,
would have been amazing.
that's the Carney wrestling promoter for you. No, you're not supposed to stab him until after the show.
Right.
You know.
Yeah,
Exactly. Let
hey,
him work. Let's sell some more tickets. If people hear he's not here, maybe they leave. I don't know. But yeah, if they wanted to get rid of him, let him work first. And when he's in the shower after packing up his bag, you don't do it when Tony Atlas is sitting there and we just got up from our little football huddle here.
Right. And so Tony, they get him an ambulance, and they don't really say how long that took, but I'm sure that wasn't immediate. Carlos Colon acts like he wasn't involved, like he's trying to get Jose back, and he says, "Is there anything I can do for you, Brody?" and all this, and that kind of came across to me as he's like this really smug, like slimy businessman, and he So Tony Atlas says as he's getting in the ambulance to go with him, that he's getting this kind of vibe from the people around, like, why are you getting involved in this? And it's hard to think about that today because, today, I mean, wrestling is considered a brotherhood more than anything. And so if something like this were to happen at 99% of the shows that I'm familiar with, probably everybody in that locker room is probably going to beat the bejesus out of Jose before turning him over to the authorities. But in this instance, this is a different world, man. These people were here to make money and not to make friends. Um, Mick Foley recalls the adage in the wrestling business. If you make it out with a single friend, then you've done well. And I think Tony Atlas is certainly that guy for Bruiser Brody here. He talks about going to the hospital with him and them just kind of disregarding him like he's laying there for hours. And they're like, the guy says, man, a stabbing here is like having a cold in the U.S. Until finally he has to physically pick up a doctor, which, apart from these circumstances, that was probably very humorous. To watch Bruiser Brody just pick this dude up and just carry him over, then the doctor's probably like kicking his legs and stuff. In any other scenario, this would have been hilarious. But basically, had to drag a doctor over there to where they said the people in the hospital were terrified of Tony Atlas at this point. Um, do you guys think he would have had a much better chance of surviving if he had gotten, more immediate care?
Yeah, something I read said that the ambulance didn't even get to the stadium for an hour.
Right.
So he laid there either in the locker room or wherever they may have moved him for a solid hour before they even got him in the ambulance.
And then the paramedics
So
couldn't pick him up, and Tony Atlas
couldn't
had
pick him up.
no telling how long they tried that.
He goes to the hospital. He gets ignored for an hour or two. I mean, yeah, I would suspect a quicker response would have probably led to him surviving.
Yeah, I kind of felt that way about it too. So
Yeah.
this is where we start to involve the authorities, right? So the authorities get called. Tony Atlas comes back to the venue, and at this point, the authorities have already been told by Carlos Colon, by Jose Gonzalez, and they don't name everybody in the locker room that was there, but other people in the locker room, that basically a fan stabbed Bruiser Brody. Now, of course, that story changes later because Jose Gonzalez in court claims self-defense. So he's pretty much acknowledging that, yeah, I was in the confrontation and I stabbed him, but the story they gave the police at the time was that a fan did it. Now, obviously, I think it would be, I mean, it's pretty obvious to everybody watching this. The authorities there did not do any due diligence on this. But Joe, what would be, based on your experience, where did they really go wrong here, and what should have been done, at this point in time?
Ooh, man, that's heavy because they did a lot wrong. I mean, clearly there was no. Supposedly they talked to everyone, and Tony Atlas comes back from the hospital and tells them, and even I believe Dutch says, "No, that's the guy right there that did it. Wasn't a fan. Here, I'll give you my statement." Um, but I really think, man, I don't know. They he eventually got charged with murder, but it was a short time later. I want to say a week or less after the incident. Bailed out the same day. So I don't think they were that interested in arresting and convicting Jose Gonzalez. Let me just start there. But I mean, yeah, the change of the story, man, you talk about that's right where an investigator hones in on this guy. You lock him into a timeline and a statement, and you work from there. So if his statement was it was a fan, and then as they're prepping for trial or whatever, and he starts saying, well, it was actually self-defense, it's time to hammer this guy. You can't, because of course, what you think up later is always better than what you're thinking of under pressure the moment it happens. So he's obviously, and maybe even after talking with an attorney, says, you know what, 6'6", 300 pounds. Look at me. Maybe we can do self defense. I'm a Puerto Rican. These guys aren't going to convict me. Look at that guy. He's a monster. And I think that's when the wheels started turning there. So I put more on the prosecutor and whoever did further investigation than these cops that were initially there. That's where the biggest failure was.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and it seemed like to me from the documentary that they never had any interest in convicting this guy. Um, it maybe, and it seems like they just kind of had the image of doing an investigation, that there wasn't
Mhm.
really an investigation. You said it took a week for them to even take the guy into custody. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean, if you got a guy that's just been stabbed and you can't find a murder weapon and there's blood all over the shower, you know, and Tony Atlas said there was still blood on the floor, where this
Yeah.
happened. There's no blood out in the hallway where they say the fan stabbed him, and you got a guy saying that's the guy, two people saying that's the guy that stabbed him right there. I mean, don't you take this guy in for questioning immediately? I mean, a week is a lot of time to get your story straight.
Oh, absolutely. And the fact that, in the US, somebody being able to be released on bond after being charged with first degree murder, it's I don't want to say impossible because improbable to a high degree, but they're saying a businessman actually paid. I'm sure it was a high bond, actually paid this, but for him to just kind of log in, get his fingerprints done, and walk out the back door, that doesn't happen in the U.S. Period.
Yeah.
So again, a little bit of Puerto Rican flavor maybe in the hometown cooking there for the guy that did the stabbing is my best guess.
And Caleb, what was your kind of opinion on this? What how did you feel like that they were just kind of shoving this under the rug?
Yes, absolutely, I did. Here was something I always questioned, right? Because we heard the story that it took him like it took them 2 hours to get him out of the stadium, right? Okay, but here's my question: how long did it take for them to actually make a phone call to the authorities?
Right.
Did Carlos Colon? Because you remember, Carlos Colon comes over to him after he's just been stabbed. Is there anything I can do for you, man? Is there anything I can do? I wonder what you can do in this instance. King.
Right.
So that's why again, obviously he is in on it, or that's my thing. And then I would say it was more. I didn't know if it was necessarily in favor of the hometown guy or if it was just look, because here's the thing. I don't know if they necessarily called the authorities until after the paramedics got there and said, "Oh no, he's been stabbed." And then the authorities come in and get involved, and he was like, "Oh no, and where was Dutch Mantel? He was there. Why didn't he tell the authorities, "Hey man, that's no, he did it. He stabbed him."
And that's where it got kind of sketch for me with him, is like his timeline didn't add up, right? Because he says he was, outside like the locker room, backstage, production area, whatever. The stabbing happens. He comes in and he says that, he went and said a prayer for him. But then they never address if he was there when the authorities came in. But when Tony Atlas gets back, the authorities are saying, "Hey, everybody in here's says has the same story." So that's one of the areas where there's a gap there with Dutch Mantel. Was he just not there? Did he go off somewhere else? He talks about wanting to get out of the building. So it's not clear if maybe he left already, but why would you leave and not tell the authorities when you know that these guys are going to try this intricate cover up? Um,
Or did Carlos Colon and them threaten some of the guys? Because you remember you heard when Tony Atlas got back that Savio Vega of all people was like, "Hey man, I got your bag because they're looking for you because you're
yeah.
talking."
Yeah, he says he didn't go back to the hotel room, man. I can only imagine how terrified he must have been. That, I mean, you've seen these guys stab a guy. They're not scared to kill someone.
And they're
And
on foreign ground and they have no contact, with anyone that they trust really. So
yeah, I mean, if you'll kill somebody, to protect your wrestling gimmick, you'll kill somebody to cover it up. You know, um, so he says he slept on the beach and was terrified for his life. Can't really blame him there. Um,
If you believe that part.
I honestly do. I do believe that part. I mean, I can see that. I can see that. That didn't seem that spectacular to me. That something like this, that would happen. I mean, that they would be looking for him because he talked to the police and he's saying, this story everybody else is telling isn't. I mean, just in the mind of Carlos Colon and Jose Gonzalez, this is the one eyewitness to the thing that could bring your entire empire down because they were it. They were the shit in Puerto Rico. They were, the territory.
They were WWE.
Right. And, so it's just, I can see it happening, and I think Tony Atlas probably was lucky to get out of there alive. Um, Now let's talk about the hotel meeting. This is where things go off the rails as far as this is where I started not believing a damn thing Abdullah had to say. Because Abdullah claims he was not in this meeting. Tony Atlas and Dutch Mantell both say he was there. Um, and he claims and he owns up to owning 5% of the company. So if the admission is I own 5% of the company, so I wasn't involved in this meeting in the hotel, does he know that they're planning this? Does he sense that they're planning this? He would have been close with Carlos Colon, and I'm not saying he was part of it, but if you own 5% of a profitable business and the guy who's the majority owner says this dude's going to come in here and try to take everything over, and they even say I believe Tony Atlas is the one that says they wanted Brody's work, but they didn't want his ideas. Um, you know, do you let something like this go by? Is it possible? Um, I don't think we'll know the answer to that question, but I know that Abdullah's testimony came immediately into question when the hotel meeting comes up and he claims to have no knowledge of it when other people place him in that meeting.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that too is he says he wasn't part of the meeting, but as the meeting is going or as the meeting is ending, that's when his family arrives, and she sees Abdullah,
Right.
and he tells her that oh no, he's dead, kind of thing. So that's where I'm like, well, now wait a minute, you weren't at the meeting, but you were right there when it ended and they showed up. At least that's what I got from the documentary. That's what I thought. That's where I thought that they had the timeline in that.
It
So
definitely doesn't add up. So you can understand why that there may not have been a conviction here. I mean, especially because as we find out later that neither of your two main witnesses ever, like Dutch Mantell says his subpoena showed up 10 days after the trial, and Tony Atlas says he never got one.
Yeah. Something else that they didn't address, but it sounds like didn't happen. I don't think Bruiser Brody's family was ever down there for the trial,
they
which
weren't.
would be the normal. If you have a victim in your family, you attend that criminal's trial and find out in person, are you getting justice for this? Now, Puerto Rico to the U.S., maybe they got theirs late too, but I'm sure Puerto Rico's prosecuting office has a victim assistance program or department because it's everywhere else. I mean, that's only natural. That's like a car having four tires. So I just, it wasn't addressed, but it didn't sound like they were there.
That's what I got from it. I don't think. I thought that she even said that no, they never got contacted or something like that.
She may have, but yeah, that's another huge failure.
I could be, but yeah, just everything that we heard afterwards just sounds like a cover up. Now, as far as Abdullah though, I'm my thing is even if Brody had come in and was going to take over, Abdullah shouldn't fear anything because he's like, well, Brody's going to book me.
Yeah,
Right.
we're making money.
Right.
Exactly.
True.
So that's where I'm kind of like, why would he care? In fact, if anything, him and Brody should have been in together.
Well, I was looking at it from the instance of you got Jose Gonzalez, who's kind of like the Puerto Rican Hulk Hogan to these guys, and Brody's talking about getting rid of him, but we don't know all the details there. We don't know if he really was drawing well, or maybe he wasn't and was just in with the boys. It's hard to tell. We won't know that information.
Mm.
Um, One last thing before we wrap this whole thing up. Um, we talk about the Hall of Fame a lot on here, and who should or should not be in it. So I gotta pose the question, Caleb, should Carlos Colon be removed from the Hall of Fame based on the details of this? Do you think?
Yes, absolutely. If you're gonna if you're gonna erase Benoit for what he did, or what and we still don't know all of the details around that, kind of thing.
We
We
know all
just
the ones we're ever gonna know about both instances, probably.
exactly. But if there's that much question into one person's, past, then this guy, it needs. So we're going to celebrate this guy who could have possibly been involved in murdering, one of the biggest superstars in history. I mean, I'm sorry. I don't agree with that. But I did not. In saying that, I didn't know this, and his two sons are in, uh, wrestling.
Yeah.
Carlito, and Carlito was amazing, So I never knew that about Carlos Colon, but I'm sitting there. If this guy refuses to talk about it and stuff like that, then obviously he's hiding something. So yes, I think he should be removed from the Hall of Fame. I don't think if you're not going to glorify Benoit, then you shouldn't glorify Cologne.
What do you think about it, Joe?
I don't think he should be removed based on this. I don't think there's solid enough evidence. But I don't necessarily think he should be in there to begin with. There's a lot of people that have been put into the Hall of Fame, which a lot of people say it only exists in Vince's brain anyway. Over the years, that I'm just kind of like, really, this guy, what did he do? Never heard of him. Or oh, he was the guy, the star for 3 years in Mexico. So what, or whatever. So I don't know that he should be removed for this, but I think he was a poor choice to begin with. I'll just say that.
I think
And
he's in there for being the promoter, not to cut you off, of World Wrestling Council. I think that's his major contribution. So I feel like if that is why he's in there, I think
I
this
think
is a
they
black
even
mark on his
mentioned that.
record.
yeah,
I think they even
definitely.
mentioned that in his Hall of Fame induction of World Wrestling Council.
Yeah.
So
What were you
The
gonna
other
say? I know I cut you off
Yeah,
there.
the other thing I looked up, Bruiser Brody apparently is in the legacy wing of the Hall of Fame. But on a very interesting note on that, his family wasn't invited to the ceremony and wasn't even told about it till the day of, is what I read.
Yeah, which is
So they're
weird.
getting the shaft every time they turn around, man.
Other than from Japan, who apparently had that
Yeah.
beautiful, like kind of like memorial for him where they honored his family, and I thought that was incredibly touching, and really just reemphasizes the reverence that the Japanese have for the art of professional wrestling. I really loved that.
That was nice, but was that Snuka that walked through there?
Yeah, we don't have to talk about that.
Okay,
That's
just
a
I
that's a spoiler. That's a future episode. Uh,
but that was Snuka in the little procession,
it was.
yeah,
right?
It was.
yeah,
I thought that was interesting.
Well, that was before he killed that girl, so it's okay.
supposedly.
No, I mean we would definitely talk about this later, but Jimmy Snuka should absolutely be removed from the Hall of Fame, 100%. But that will definitely be for another episode. Uh,
But then again, that also, brings up the question of, okay, we shouldn't glorify what they did. and everything, but can we really take away from what they meant in the ring
That's true.
and the moments that they created?
But if you hold
Are they
that,
two different things, kind of thing?
if you by that litmus test, Benoit
Right.
should be in there too.
Exactly.
And I don't. I mean, as we discussed, 2 weeks ago when this airs, uh, we don't think he ought to be in there. So it's kind of it's a Hall of Fame that only, once again, there's no physical Hall of Fame. It doesn't exist anywhere but on the internet, really, and in Vince McMahon's head. So, it is what it is. I don't know. I don't know what the criteria for somebody being removed would be. I guess if Snuka had been convicted, then
Yeah.
that would have done it. Um, but that being said, we're right at the 1 hour mark here. Caleb, you got any final thoughts on this episode?
Just we talk about it sucks that when you think of Bruiser Brody, you're going to think of his murder to be right at the top there. But it sucks because if you go back, like I said, ECW. Let's put it this way: in the '90s, if Bruiser Brody had been alive and everything like that, they'd have had him up against someone in ECW, or they'd have made him ECW champion for a little bit, and would have just said, "Hey, man, just go nuts." Like New Jack wouldn't have even been able
Yeah.
to stop Bruiser Brody. He was just, he was basically just like Andre the Giant. He was the more violent version though of Andre the Giant. Andre, when he came through, it was just, oh hi, hi, I'm Andre the Giant. No, when Bruiser Brody came through, again, I have never seen it to where people are literally running in the stands and he's swinging a chain and stuff like that. And in today's world, you could not do that. You couldn't even do that if you were a wrestler, today. You couldn't do that because someone would take liberty in their own hands.
It would
But
never
back,
happen.
yeah, exactly.
The
But back
promotion you're
then,
working for would get sued. Somebody gets smacked in the face with that chain.
yeah,
You can't even get people to move out of, like, when the guy's sitting there, like, move out of the chairs, and people would just sit there, and then the guy
Yep.
dives out onto him, and then people are like, oh, why did this happen? You know, that's what.
exactly. Like, but I don't think people realize just how big though he was in Japan. I mean, this guy was basically Hulk Hogan in Japan.
To this day, I mean, still,
Exactly. Like
still
even
honored.
when you talk about New Japan and you see the New Japan champions and stuff like that, I believe he shows up. Like I believe he was champion, and like they show his picture and stuff like that, and he always gets like a huge ovation when when his picture shows up. So I think I'm glad that Dark Side of the Ring brought this incident to life and everything, because I think a lot of people have forgotten it. A lot of people didn't know the full story about it. But I think, again, if that's all you know about Bruiser Brody, then you really need to go check out this work. And if you're a hardcore guy, if you're a brawler, if you're anything, just go and watch those matches and take some notes, because those guys were hardcore before there was even the word. They were extreme. They were, all this. They were that before that. So it was a good episode. I really enjoyed it.
And the funny thing, I was like, I wonder what'll happen if I type into Google. If you just put in who stabbed Bruiser Brody, it just immediately comes up with Jose Gonzalez. um, anyway, Joe, what about you, man? What's your kind of like wrap up thoughts on this whole episode?
Yeah, one of the things I was just thinking of, the fact that he is revered in Japan could have something to do with their culture, with samurais and things. To die in battle, you have so much more honor than someone who just kind of retires. And he died at an event. It wasn't in the ring, but that could lend some of the respect that's given to him in Japan as opposed to the U.S. or whatever. The other thing I was looking at, he was 42 when this happened. And with him asking for that money, wanting to buy a company, I wonder if he was looking at like the next 8 years. Hey, I got to start winding down. I can't have people stabbing me with a fork in the head once a week for the next 8 years. Maybe he was hoping to roll into one of those promoter booker positions and, ride off into the sunset. So, his peak had probably already happened, even though a lot of people weren't familiar with him, no national television type stuff. But I think that was probably going through his head.
Yeah, that's definitely valid because, his wife even talks about that, once his son was born, providing for his son was his top priority. And, I'm sure he realized that the wear and tear that was going to happen to his body over the years. I mean, we know a lot more about that kind of thing today with CTE and, just like the overall wear and tear that, being in a car crash every night, which is what a wrestling match equates to, has on your body. But it's not like then they didn't know it all. I mean, there were still the generation before them, you know, um, that you could look at the condition that your kind of big champions from years past were in, you know. So um, anyway, Joe, thank you so much for joining us here today and providing your kind of expertise and perspective on this episode. Definitely been an honor to have you on.
Hey, thank you, man. It's been an honor to be here with you guys.
And we're not going to let you out of here without plugging your stuff. So you can check out Joe Brown on Suplexes and Microphones. Give him a subscribe on YouTube. They have a ton of great interviews with all sorts of wrestling talent, all the way up from the legendary Rock and Roll Express, all the way down to some of your kind of hometown indie favorites. So definitely give that a check. Suplexes and Microphones. Um, and then also, as always, you can hear my co-host Caleb Stovall on the Stovall Wrestling Network. Caleb, when's the next episode coming out?
Tuesday.
We do it every Tuesday now. Is that the
Tuesday,
plan?
every Tuesday. Yeah, we don't have like a specific time on Tuesday, but it will most likely be Tuesdays.
Perfect, perfect. And you can hear this podcast every Sunday at 8 p.m. You can check out Entertainment Evolved for everything you want to know about this podcast, and we have several other affiliate programs that are on there right now. And we're very happy to be proud of the Entertainment Evolved network. And thank you once again, everybody, for joining us. This has been an Evolved Review.